Good evening, guys. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into a fascinating question from the heart of the Middle Ages. How did people sleep in massive freezing stone castles without turning into ice blocks? Get cozy, relax, and let's travel back in time to discover the clever, strange, and surprisingly cozy ways medieval people survived the cold nights. Let's begin. Imagine living inside a massive stone refrigerator with icy drafts whistling down every corridor. It sounds unbearable, right? Yet, for centuries, people not only survived, but thrived in these conditions. So, how did they do it? Let's uncover the clever, surprising, and sometimes downright bizarre secrets of staying warm in a medieval castle. First things first, let's talk about the heart of the castle, the Great Hall. This was the central hub of warmth and community. A massive, roaring fireplace, often big enough to stand in, was kept blazing day and night. But this wasn't just for show. The heat it generated was immense, and the entire household, from the lord and lady to the humblest servant, would gather here to share its warmth, eat, and socialize. The smoke, however, was another story. With only a simple hole in the roof for a chimney, these halls could get incredibly smoky. But hey, a little smoke was a small price to pay for not freezing to death. Now, what about when it was time to sleep? Private chambers, especially for the nobility, were much smaller than the Great Hall, making them easier to heat. They had their own fireplaces, but the real secret weapon was fabric, and lots of it. Thick, heavy tapestries weren't just for decoration. They were a crucial layer of insulation, covering the cold stone walls and trapping precious heat inside. Think of them as medieval Lyra wall insulation. They blocked drafts and made the room feel significantly cozier. But the real luxury was the bed. Forget your simple mattress and duvet. A medieval lord's bed was a fortress of warmth. We're talking about a massive four-poster bed, completely enclosed by thick, often velvet, curtains. When drawn, these curtains created a tiny, insulated room within a room. Inside, they'd pile on layers of feather beds, wool blankets, and fur throws. It was like sleeping in a cozy fabric cocoon, completely shielded from the freezing air outside. Sometimes they even used bed warmers' long-handled metal pans filled with hot coals from the fire to preheat the sheets before climbing in. Of course, not everyone was a lord or lady. Servants and soldiers often slept in communal dormitories, huddled together for warmth on straw mattresses near the kitchens or the Great Hall's fireplace. Personal clothing was also key. Everyone wore layers of wool, which is a fantastic natural insulator, even when damp. And at night, many people simply slept in their underclothes, pulling on extra layers or a nightcap to keep their heads warm. It was a combination of clever architecture, luxurious textiles, and simple, practical habits that made life in a freezing stone castle not just survivable, but comfortable. Those massive stone walls that were great for defense turned into iceboxes when the temperature dropped. Your breath would hang in the air like a ghost, and frost would creep across the inner walls. It sounds miserable, right? So, how did they do it? How did they sleep through the night when the very structure they lived in was trying to turn them into a popsicle? Well, they had some surprisingly clever tricks up their sleeves. And it wasn't just about huddling by the fire. We're going to pull back the tapestries of time and uncover the secrets to staying warm in a medieval fortress. From the great lord in his private chamber to the humble servant in the dormitory, everyone had a strategy for survival. The first line of defense against the biting cold was, of course, the fireplace. But these weren't the cozy, efficient fireplaces we have today. In the early medieval period, you'd find a central hearth, basically a stone-lined fire pit, in the middle of the great hall. Smoke would just drift up towards a hole in the roof. It was smoky, inefficient, and most of the heat went straight up and out. Still, it was better than nothing. People would gather around it, not just for warmth, but for light and community. Later on, wall fireplaces with chimneys became more common, especially in the private chambers of the nobility. These were a huge improvement. They drew the smoke out better and radiated more heat into the room. But here's the catch. A single fireplace, even a big one, could barely warm a massive, drafty castle room. The heat just didn't travel far. So, while it was toasty, right next to the flames, a few steps away, you were back in the freezing cold. They burned enormous amounts of wood to keep these fires going day and night. Entire forests were managed just to supply a castle with firewood for the winter. It was a constant, labor-intensive job for servants to haul logs and tend the flames. So if fireplaces weren't enough, what else did they do? The answer is layers. And I'm not just talking about clothes. They layered their rooms. The most important weapon in the war against cold was the tapestry. We see them in movies and think of them as just decoration, but they were a vital piece of insulation technology. These huge, heavy woven cloths were hung on the cold stone walls. They trapped a layer of air between the fabric and the stone, which acted as a surprisingly effective insulator, stopping the cold from radiating into the room. It's the same principle as double-glazed windows. Plus, they blocked drafts that whistled through cracks in the stonework. The floors, also made of cold stone, were covered with layers of rush matting, often mixed with sweet-smelling herbs to combat the damp and musty odors. On top of that, they'd lay down thick animal furs or expensive woolen carpets imported from the East. Essentially, they were creating a soft, warm room within a room, a textile bubble to protect them from the harshness of the stone. This made a tremendous difference in the actual, livable temperature of the chamber. Now, let's get into the bed itself, because this is where things get really interesting. The bed was the ultimate sanctuary from the cold. For the nobility, we're talking about the iconic four-poster bed. This wasn't just a status symbol. It was a highly practical piece of survival gear. The bed would be enclosed with thick, heavy curtains, often made of velvet or wool and lined with fur. When these curtains were drawn, they created a small, enclosed tent. A person's own body heat, trapped inside this bed tent, would warm up the space considerably. It was a personal microclimate, a cozy little cocoon shielded from the freezing drafts of the larger room. The mattress itself wasn't what we're used to. It was a cloth sack stuffed with whatever was available. For the rich, that meant soft feathers, down, or wool, which are excellent insulators. For the less well-off, it might be straw, horsehair, or even pea shucks. While not as comfortable, a thick layer of straw still provides a good barrier against the cold rising from below. On top of this, you'd have linen sheets, but the real warmth came from the blankets. These were made of heavy wool, and for the wealthy, they were topped with incredibly valuable and warm fur coverlets made from squirrel, fox, or marten. People would pile these on, layering themselves in a warm nest for the night. But what about an extra boost of warmth on those especially frigid nights? They had a medieval version of the hot water bottle. These were warming pans. A warming pan was a metal container, usually brass or copper, with a long handle. It looked a bit like a covered frying pan. Servants would fill it with hot embers or heated coals from the fireplace, close the lid, and then slide it between the sheets of the bed before their lord or lady retired for the night. They had to be careful not to set the bed on fire, of course. The pan would warm the bedding through, making it blissfully toasty to climb into. Another method was to heat up stones or bricks by the fire, wrap them in cloth, and place them at the foot of the bed. It's a simple but effective way to keep your feet from turning into blocks of ice. And don't forget about body heat. It wasn't uncommon for people to share beds, not for romantic reasons, but purely for survival. Servants often slept in communal dormitories, huddled together on straw pallets for shared warmth. Even noble families might share sleeping spaces more than we'd imagine. A lady's maids might sleep on truckle beds, small cots on wheels that could be rolled out from under her own grand bed at night. And of course, the family dogs were often welcome to sleep at the foot of the bed, adding their own furry warmth to the pile. Clothing was also a critical part of the equation. People didn't sleep in flimsy pajamas. They wore dedicated sleepwear, which was essentially another layer of their daily clothes. This would be a long linen shirt or smock, sometimes with sleeping caps or coifs to keep their heads warm, since a lot of body heat is lost through the head. Upon waking, they wouldn't just jump out of bed into the cold air. A servant would bring their clothes, which had been warming by the fire, directly to the bedside. They would get dressed inside the warm tent of their bed curtains before ever having to face the frigid temperature of the room. Think about that luxury. Your clothes, pre-warmed for you every morning. They also wore layers indoors throughout the day. The base layer was linen, and on top of that came multiple layers of wool. Wool is a fantastic insulator. It stays warm even when it gets a bit damp, which was common in castles. The wealthy would also wear fur-lined robes and slippers indoors. They were essentially wearing their own personal insulation all day long. So by the time they went to bed, they were already retaining a good amount of body heat. So, let's put it all together. Imagine you are a medieval lord settling in for the night. The great hall fire is roaring, but the wind is howling outside. You walk through a hallway lined with thick tapestries that dull the chill from the stone walls. You enter your private chamber, where another fireplace crackles merrily. A servant has already used a warming pan to heat your bed. You part the heavy velvet curtains of your four-poster bed and climb into a space that feels instantly warmer than the room around it. You sink into a soft feather mattress, pull up layers of woolen blankets and a heavy fur coverlet. You might even have a faithful hound curled up at your feet. You're wearing a warm nightshirt and cap, tucked into this cozy, layered fortress, shielded from the cold and drafts. You could actually get a pretty comfortable night's sleep, even as a frost pattern formed on the stone wall just a few feet away. It was a system of layers, layered rooms, layered beds, and layered clothing, all working together. Life in a medieval castle was harsh, especially in winter, but through these clever and practical strategies, people didn't just survive the cold nights. They created pockets of warmth and comfort in their stone fortresses. It really shows the ingenuity people have always had when it comes to adapting to their environment. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into history. Have you ever wondered how people in medieval castles didn't freeze to death during winter? Looking at these stone giants, you'd think they were just massive, beautiful refrigerators. And honestly, you wouldn't be far off. Castles were notoriously cold, damp, and drafty. So, how did they survive the biting chill, especially at night? It's a fascinating story of clever design and social hierarchy. First, let's get one thing straight. Not everyone in the castle had the same winter experience. Your comfort level depended entirely on your status. If you were a servant, a guard, or just a common soldier, your winter was pretty miserable. You'd be sleeping in the coldest parts of the castle, like the gatehouse, the towers, or rooms along the outer stone walls. These areas were drafty and exposed, with little to no heating. Your bed was likely a simple straw pallet on the floor, and your only warmth came from a rough woolen blanket and huddling together with others. It was a constant battle against the cold. But what if you were the lord or lady of the castle? Well, your situation was much, much better. The secret to their survival was all about location, location, location. The outer layers are cold and exposed, but the inner layers are more protected. The solar was usually located on an upper floor, often right above the Great Hall. This was a brilliant design choice. Heat from the massive fireplace in the Great Hall below would rise, warming the floor of the solar. These inner chambers were also designed to be as insulated as possible. While the outer walls were thick, unforgiving stone, the inner rooms were a different story. Imagine huge, woven masterpieces depicting epic battles or beautiful landscapes hanging on every wall. Your own body heat, combined with that of anyone else in the bed, would be trapped inside this fabric tent, making it surprisingly cozy. It was like building your own personal fort against the cold every single night. Inside this cozy bed tent, they didn't just have one blanket, they had layers. The mattress itself was a thick bag stuffed with feathers or soft wool, which was much warmer than a servant's straw pallet. On top of that, they'd pile on linen sheets, woolen blankets, and luxurious, expensive fur throws made from animals like squirrel, marten, or even ermine for the very wealthy. They would literally bury themselves under a mountain of insulating layers to stay warm. And they had one more trick up their sleeve, the bed warmer. This was a metal pan with a long handle, often made of brass or copper. You'd fill the pan with hot coals from the fireplace, close the lid, and then slide it between the sheets before getting into bed. It would preheat the bed, making that initial shock of cold linen a thing of the past. It was the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket. Of course, you had to be careful not to set the bed on fire, which was a very real danger. The fireplace was another key feature. Unlike the giant, open hearth in the Great Hall, designed to heat a massive space, the fireplace in the solar was smaller and more efficient. It was a private source of heat, dedicated solely to warming the lord and lady's chambers. They would keep a fire roaring day and night during the coldest months, and a servant's job was to ensure it never went out. The radiant heat from the fire, combined with all the other insulation, made the solar a genuine sanctuary from the winter's fury. Even clothing played a role. People didn't sleep in the nude or in thin pajamas like we do today. They wore night clothes, usually a long linen shirt called a smock or chemise, and a nightcap. The nightcap was especially important because you lose a lot of heat through your head. Keeping your head covered was a simple but effective way to stay warmer throughout the night. So, while the image of a medieval castle in winter might seem bleak and frozen, life for the nobility was surprisingly comfortable. Through clever architectural placement, layers of insulation like tapestries and rushes, and the ingenious design of the four-poster bed, they created warm, cozy pockets of civilization within their cold stone fortresses. It was a world of stark contrasts, where a few feet and a stone wall could separate shivering misery from insulated comfort. Next time you see a picture of a grand medieval castle, don't just see the cold stone. Imagine the bustling great hall, the heat rising to the solar above, the rich tapestries on the walls, and the lord and lady tucked away in their curtained bed, safe and warm against the winter night. It just goes to show that for centuries, humans have been finding clever ways to make even the most imposing structures a little more like home. Have you ever wondered how people in those huge, drafty medieval castles managed to survive a freezing winter night without modern heating? It sounds impossible, right? You picture stone walls, no insulation, and wind whistling through every crack. Well, the answer is surprisingly simple and communal. They all gathered together in the Great Hall. Forget the romantic idea of private, cozy bedrooms for everyone. That was a luxury reserved for the lord and lady of the castle, and even their chambers were far from toasty. For most of the castle's inhabitants, servants, soldiers, and guests, the Great Hall was the warmest and safest place to be. Throughout the day, this massive room was the heart of the castle, used for dining, holding court, and all sorts of business. But when night fell, it transformed into a giant communal dormitory. The key to survival was the enormous fireplace. We're not talking about your average living room hearth. These were colossal structures, sometimes large enough for a person to stand inside, and they burned massive logs all day and all night. The heat they kicked out was immense, creating a pocket of life-saving warmth in an otherwise frigid environment. People would unroll their sleeping pallets, which were essentially just thin mattresses stuffed with straw or wool, and lay them out on the floor as close to the fire as they could possibly get. The floor would be covered with rushes or straw, which offered a tiny bit of insulation from the cold stone beneath. It wasn't a silent or private affair. Imagine a room full of people, snoring, coughing, and shuffling around. You'd be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with dozens of others. This close proximity wasn't just for a lack of space. It was a survival strategy. Huddling together shared body heat, making everyone a little bit warmer. It was a trade-off. You sacrificed privacy for warmth and life. People would sleep fully clothed, often in the same outfits they wore during the day, and pull whatever blankets or animal furs they owned over themselves. These blankets weren't just for warmth, they were prized possessions. Now, you might be thinking, what about the smoke? With a fire that big, the air quality couldn't have been great. And you'd be right. Early medieval halls didn't even have proper chimneys. They often just had a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. So, the Great Hall would have been a smoky, smelly place, filled with the aroma of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and leftover food. But again, a smoky room was infinitely better than freezing to death in a cold one. This communal sleeping arrangement also had a security benefit. With everyone gathered in one place, it was easier to guard against intruders or respond to an alarm. A lone person sleeping in a remote part of the castle would be a much easier target. In the great hall, there was safety in numbers. The glow of the fire provided a constant source of light, and the presence of so many people created a sense of shared security against the dark and dangerous night. As architectural designs evolved, things started to change slightly. Chimneys became more common, which drastically improved the air quality. More partitions and separate rooms were built, offering a bit more privacy for higher-ranking individuals. But for a very long time, the image of a great hall filled with people sleeping around a roaring fire was the reality of castle life. It was a practical solution to a deadly problem. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't private, and it certainly wasn't clean by our standards, but it was effective. It shows us how resourceful and resilient people were, adapting their lives to the harsh realities of their world. So next time you see a grand medieval hall in a movie, don't just picture lavish feasts. Picture it at night, a smoky, crowded, but life-sustaining sanctuary against the biting cold. You see these grand stone fortresses in movies and think, wow, how majestic. But have you ever stopped to think how incredibly cold they must have been? Forget central heating. We're talking about a time when your own breath would turn to mist the moment you woke up. So, did nobles just shiver themselves to sleep in their fancy, freezing bedrooms? The main source of heat in a castle was, of course, the fireplace. But these weren't the efficient, cozy fireplaces we have today. Picture this, a massive, cavernous stone room, maybe the Lord's private chamber. In one wall, there's a huge fireplace, roaring with a crackling fire. It sounds nice, right? Well, here's the catch. That fire was really only effective if you were standing right next to it. The rest of the room, practically an icebox. The stone walls acted like giant refrigerators, sucking all the warmth out of the air. Frost would literally creep across the stone, and drafts would whistle through every crack and crevice. The heat from the fireplace would rise straight up the chimney, taking most of the precious warmth with it. So while your front might be toasty, your back would still be freezing. Now, you might be thinking, what about the Great Hall? That was the heart of the castle, a huge communal space where everyone gathered. These halls had even bigger fireplaces, sometimes a central hearth, right in the middle of the room. This was better, for sure. The combined body heat of dozens of people, plus a massive fire, could make the space somewhat comfortable. People would eat, work, and even sleep in the Great Hall to stay warm. It was the social and thermal hub of the castle. But once you retreated to your private chambers, the cold would hit you like a physical wall. Privacy was a luxury that came at a very cold price. So, how did they cope? They didn't just accept being cold, they were masters of layering. Forget a simple duvet. We're talking about a mountain of textiles. Beds were architectural marvels in themselves. The iconic four-poster bed wasn't just for show. It was a room within a room. Thick, heavy curtains, often made of wool or velvet, would be drawn all around the bed, trapping body heat and creating a cozy little microclimate. Inside this fabric tent, you'd be sleeping on a mattress stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool for insulation from the cold bed frame. And then came the blankets. Lots of them. We're talking multiple layers of heavy wool blankets and luxurious furs from animals like bear, wolf, or fox. People would pile them on, creating a heavy, warm cocoon to sleep in. They also wore their clothes to bed. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in their undergarments, or even some of their day clothes, plus a nightcap to keep their head warm. Remember, a lot of body heat is lost through your head, so a simple cloth cap could make a big difference in comfort. They'd also use warming pans. This was basically a metal pan with a long handle filled with hot embers from the fire. Before getting into bed, a servant would run this pan between the sheets to warm them up. It was the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket. A little bit of preheating went a long way in making the icy bed more inviting. Let's not forget about tapestries. Those beautiful, intricate wall hangings you see in museums weren't just for decoration. They were a crucial form of insulation. Hanging heavy woven tapestries on the cold stone walls helped to block drafts and trap a layer of air, which slowed down heat loss. It was like wrapping the room in a giant blanket. The wealthier you were, the more tapestries you could afford, and therefore, the warmer your room would be. Every little bit helped in the constant battle against the cold. What about the less fortunate inhabitants of the castle, like the servants? They didn't have private chambers with fireplaces or four-poster beds. They often slept in communal dormitories, sometimes in the lofts above the kitchens or bakehouses, where residual heat from the ovens would provide some warmth. They would huddle together for body heat, sleeping on simple straw pallets on the floor, with maybe 1 or 2 rough woolen blankets to share. Their existence was a lot colder and tougher than that of the lord and lady. Another clever trick was the use of rushes on the floor. The stone floors were, as you can imagine, freezing cold. To combat this, they would cover the floors with a thick layer of dried reeds and herbs, known as rushes. This layer provided insulation, making the floor slightly warmer to walk on. As a bonus, the herbs would help mask some of the less pleasant smells of castle life. Every so often, they'd sweep out the old, dirty rushes and lay down a fresh layer. Even with all these measures, winter in a medieval castle was a test of endurance. Sickness was common, and the cold could be genuinely dangerous, especially for the very young, the old, or the unwell. The constant damp and chill would seep into your bones. It's a far cry from the romanticized image we often have. Life was dictated by the seasons in a very real and direct way. Winter was a time to hunker down, conserve energy, and simply try to survive until the spring thaw. So, the next time you see a movie set in a majestic medieval castle, take a closer look. Notice the fireplaces, the tapestries, the heavy curtains around the beds. They aren't just set dressing. They're clues to a daily struggle for survival. People in medieval castles didn't just freeze. They fought back with every tool and trick they had, from roaring fires and fur blankets to the simple act of huddling together for warmth. It really makes you appreciate your central heating, doesn't it? Ever wondered how people in those drafty medieval castles managed to sleep without turning into human popsicles? It's a great question. Castles look romantic, but they were basically giant stone refrigerators. The walls were thick, but they were terrible at insulation, and glass was a rare luxury. So, how did they do it? Well, The answer lies in a clever piece of furniture, the canopy bed. You might think of them as grand and decorative, but their main purpose was survival. These beds were like a room within a room, a cozy tent pitched right in the middle of a freezing stone chamber. Heavy curtains, often made of thick wool or velvet, would be drawn all around the bed at night. This simple act trapped the sleeper's body heat, creating a warm microclimate inside. It was surprisingly effective. Think of it like a personal fabric-walled sauna, shielding you from the biting drafts that whistled through the castle. But the curtains were just the start. The bed itself was a whole system designed for warmth. The mattress, or what passed for one, wasn't just a thin pad. It was a deep sack stuffed with whatever soft, insulating material was available. For the wealthy, this meant feathers goose or swan down were the best. This created a thick, fluffy barrier that insulated them from the cold air underneath the bed frame. For those less fortunate, the stuffing might be straw, wool, or even dried leaves. It might not sound comfortable to us, but a thick layer of straw is actually a fantastic insulator. They'd pile these mattresses high, creating a deep, nest-like bed to sink into. And what about under the mattress? The base of the bed wasn't solid. It was usually a web of ropes, crisscrossed and pulled taut. This rope system provided suspension, a bit like a modern box spring, but it also allowed for airflow. Now, you might think airflow is bad when it's cold, but this was strategic. It prevented moisture from building up in the mattress, which would have made it damp, cold, and moldy. You've probably heard the phrase, sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite. The sleep tight part might refer to tightening these ropes to make the bed firm and comfortable. So you have your tent-like curtains and your feather-stuffed mattress. What else? Layers, layers, and more layers. Just like we pile on blankets today, medieval sleepers would have used multiple coverings. Sheets were typically made of linen. On top of that would go blankets woven from heavy wool. And for the truly wealthy, the final layer might be a quilt or a fur throw. Bearskin, wolfskin, or fox fur weren't just for show. They provided incredible warmth. Imagine being tucked into a feather bed, surrounded by heavy wool curtains, and covered with a thick fur pelt. Suddenly, that freezing castle chamber doesn't seem so bad, does it? People also didn't necessarily sleep alone. It was common for family members or even trusted servants to share a bed for warmth. The more bodies, the more body heat gets trapped under the covers and within the canopy. In noble households, it wasn't unusual for a lord and lady to share their bed, but sometimes children or personal attendants might sleep on a smaller truckle bed that rolled underneath the main one, sharing the warmth of the same general space. This communal sleeping arrangement was a practical solution to a life-threatening problem, and they had other tricks up their sleeves, too. A bed warmer was a common tool. This was a metal pan with a long handle and a hinged lid. You'd fill it with hot coals or embers from the fireplace, close the lid, and then slide it between the sheets to warm up the bed before you got in. It was basically a medieval electric blanket. You had to be careful not to set the bed on fire, of course, but it was a wonderfully effective way to take the initial chill off the cold linen sheets. Let's not forget about personal attire either. People didn't sleep in the nude. They wore nightgowns, nightshirts, and nightcaps. These were long garments, usually made of linen or wool, designed to keep them covered from neck to toe. A nightcap was especially important because you can lose a lot of body heat through your head. So, a warm cap helped keep that precious heat from escaping while you slept. Finally, the placement of the bed itself was crucial. The master bedroom, or solar, was usually located on an upper floor, right above the Great Hall. Heat from the massive fireplace in the hall would rise, warming the floor of the room above. The bed would be placed in the warmest part of the room, far away from drafty windows or the cold stone walls. Every single detail, from the room's location to the hat on your head, was part of a carefully considered strategy to stay warm and survive the night. So, the next time you see a picture of a grand canopy bed in a medieval castle, don't just see a piece of furniture. See it for what it truly was: a high-tech survival pod, a cozy fortress against the cold, and a testament to human ingenuity. It's amazing how they used simple materials and clever design to create comfort in some of the harshest living conditions imaginable. It really makes you appreciate your central heating, doesn't it? There was no central heating, no double-glazed windows, just stone, stone, and more stone. So, how did they stay warm enough to even fall asleep? The answer is surprisingly simple and quite clever: bed curtains. Now, when you think of bed curtains, you might picture something purely decorative, like what you'd see in a fairy tale princess's room. But in the Middle Ages, these weren't just for show. They were a crucial piece of survival technology. Castles were notoriously drafty. Cold air would seep through every crack in the stone walls, through gaps around the windows, and under the doors. It was a constant battle against the cold. Imagine lying in your bed, trying to sleep, while an icy breeze blows across your face all night. It would be impossible to get comfortable, let alone stay healthy. This is where the four-poster bed with its heavy curtains came in. These weren't light, flimsy drapes. We're talking about thick, heavy fabrics like wool or velvet, often lined with other materials to make them even more insulating. When you drew those curtains shut, you were essentially creating a small, self-contained room within a room. It was like a cozy little tent right in the middle of your freezing bedchamber. Your own body heat would get trapped inside this fabric box, warming up the small space around you. It was a simple but incredibly effective way to create a microclimate that was much warmer and more comfortable than the rest of the room. The curtains acted as a barrier, blocking those relentless drafts and keeping the precious warmth in. This was especially important for the lord and lady of the castle, whose chambers were often large and high-ceilinged, making them even harder to heat. A large fireplace would be roaring at one end of the room, but its heat wouldn't reach every corner. The bed, enclosed in its curtains, became a personal sanctuary of warmth. But warmth wasn't the only reason for these curtains. They also offered a degree of privacy, which was a rare luxury in a medieval household. Castles were bustling places. It wasn't uncommon for high-ranking nobles to have servants sleeping in the same room, ready to attend to their needs at a moment's notice. The bed curtains provided a visual barrier, a small slice of personal space in a world where privacy was almost non-existent. You could have a private conversation, get changed, or just be alone for a while, all within the confines of your curtained bed. So, the next time you see a picture of a grand, medieval four-poster bed, remember that those heavy, ornate curtains were much more than just decoration. They were a brilliant solution to the very real problems of cold and lack of privacy. They were a shield against the freezing drafts of the castle, a cozy cocoon that made sleep possible, and a small, but significant symbol of status and comfort in a harsh and chilly world. It's a fascinating example of how people in the past used ingenuity to make their lives just a little bit more comfortable. You might picture roaring fireplaces and cozy fur blankets, but the reality was much, much colder. Castles were fortresses first, and homes second. Their thick stone walls, designed to withstand a siege, were terrible at keeping in heat. Windows were often just small openings with wooden shutters, not glass, letting icy winds whip right through the corridors. So, how did anyone get any sleep without freezing to death? The answer might surprise you. They all piled into bed together. That's right, sharing a bed wasn't just for married couples. It was a common, practical solution for survival. Entire families, servants, and even guests would huddle together under one big pile of blankets and straw-stuffed mattresses. Think of it as a human-powered heating system. The more bodies, the more body heat, and the warmer everyone stayed. It was a matter of life and death, not intimacy or privacy. Privacy, as we know it today, was a luxury most medieval people simply couldn't afford. Let's dive into the great bed culture. The centerpiece of any respectable medieval bedroom was the bed itself, and it was often massive. The most famous example is the Great Bed of Ware, built in the late 16th century, which could supposedly sleep for couples at once. While that was an extreme case, large beds were common. The lord and lady of the castle would have the best spot, of course, often in a grand four-poster bed with heavy curtains. These curtains weren't just for decoration. They created a small, enclosed room within a room, trapping precious warmth and keeping out drafts. But what about everyone else? Well, they'd get cozy too. The lord and lady might share their bed with their children, a trusted servant, or even a visiting nobleman. Rank mattered, of course. The most important person got the warmest, most comfortable spot, usually in the middle, while those of lower status were relegated to the colder edges. It was a social hierarchy, played out even in sleep. You might find yourself sharing a bed with your siblings, your parents, and maybe even a traveling pilgrim who was offered a place to stay for the night. This practice wasn't limited to the lord's family. Servants had their own sleeping arrangements, but the principle was the same. In the great hall, after the fires died down, servants would often sleep on simple straw pallets on the floor. To stay warm, they would cluster together, sharing blankets and body heat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. In a world without central heating, generating warmth through human contact was the most reliable method available. It was a communal way of life, born out of necessity. You might be thinking, what about hygiene? Well, medieval standards were very different from ours. People generally slept in their underclothes, the same linen shifts or shirts they wore during the day. While they didn't have daily showers, they did value cleanliness. Bed linens were changed, and personal hygiene was practiced. But the immediate threat of freezing was a much bigger concern than the potential for smelling your bedmate. The straw in mattresses was also changed periodically to keep things relatively fresh and deter pests. The arrangement also provided a sense of security. Castles could be dangerous places, not just from outside threats, but from within. Sleeping in a group offered protection. A lone sleeper was more vulnerable to attack or theft. In a communal bed, there was safety in numbers. Everyone was in it together, watching out for each other, even in their sleep. This sense of shared vulnerability fostered a strong community bond. It's a stark contrast to our modern desire for personal space and private bedrooms. This tradition of bed sharing wasn't just a European thing either. Across many cultures and time periods, before modern heating, people huddled together for warmth. It was a universal human solution to a universal problem, surviving the cold. The concept of a private bedroom for every individual is a relatively recent invention, a product of increasing wealth and technological advancements like central heating. For most of human history, sleep was a social activity. So, the next time you see a grand medieval castle in a movie, remember the unseen reality. Behind those imposing stone walls, the air was frigid. The magnificent tapestries weren't just for show. They were a desperate attempt to block drafts. And the most valuable source of heat wasn't the fireplace, which warmed only a small area, but the people themselves. They relied on each other, sharing their beds and their body heat to make it through the long, cold nights. It was a world where community wasn't just a social ideal. It was a fundamental survival strategy. It really makes you appreciate your cozy bed and central heating, doesn't it? The simple act of sleeping alone in a warm room is a luxury that our medieval ancestors could only dream of. Their world was tougher, colder, and far less private, but they found ingenious, communal ways to endure. Forget about central heating. That was a distant dream. So, how did they survive the bone-chilling nights? Let's dive into the cozy and sometimes surprising world of medieval bedtime. First, let's talk about the beds themselves. If you were a lord or a lady, your bed was a fortress against the cold. The four-poster bed wasn't just for show. It was a practical piece of engineering. Heavy curtains, often made of thick wool or velvet, were hung all around it. When you drew those curtains shut, you created a small, insulated room within a room. This bed tent would trap your body heat, making the space significantly warmer than the rest of the freezing chamber. Think of it as your own personal microclimate. The air inside could be several degrees warmer, which made all the difference on a frigid night. But the curtains were only part of the solution. The real secret weapon against the cold was layering, and I mean serious layering. The mattress itself was a key component. It wasn't like the memory foam we have today. A typical medieval mattress was a large sack called a palliasse, stuffed with whatever soft, insulating material was available. For the wealthy, this might be feathers or down, creating a soft, lofty bed. But for most, it was stuffed with straw, horsehair, or even wool scraps. While not as luxurious, these materials still provided a crucial barrier between the sleeper and the cold wooden bed frame. On top of this, they might place a softer feather bed for extra comfort and warmth. They piled them on, and the materials were key. Wool was the fabric of choice for good reason. This was a long-handled metal pan, usually made of brass or copper, with a hinged lid. You'd fill it with hot coals or embers from the fireplace, close the lid, and then run it between the sheets before getting into bed. It was like a primitive electric blanket, preheating the mattress and covers to take the initial icy chill off. You had to be careful, of course, not to set the bed on fire. And don't forget personal attire. People didn't sleep in silky pajamas. They wore night clothes, including long nightshirts and nightcaps. A nightcap was especially important. You lose a lot of body heat through your head, so wearing a cap made of wool or linen helped keep you significantly warmer throughout the night. It seems simple, but it was a crucial part of the medieval sleep system. So, when you picture a medieval castle bedroom, don't just see a cold, dark room. See a carefully constructed system designed for survival and comfort. From the four-poster bed with its heavy drapes, creating a cozy cocoon, to the layers upon layers of straw, feathers, wool, and luxurious fur, every element had a purpose. They used clever tools like bed warmers and simple solutions like nightcaps to fight the relentless cold. It was a constant battle against the elements, and in the world of medieval sleep, warmth was the ultimate victory. If you found this glimpse into the past interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Did they just shiver themselves to sleep on cold, hard stone? Well, not exactly. The reality of medieval slumber is far more fascinating and, frankly, a lot cozier than you might think. Let's pull back the velvet curtains and peek into the medieval bedroom. First, forget the Hollywood image of a lonely king in a vast, empty chamber. Castles were bustling places, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. Most people, from servants to soldiers, slept communally. They huddled together in great halls or barracks, sharing body heat to stay warm. It was a practical solution to a bone-chilling problem. The stone walls of a castle were fantastic for defense, but terrible for insulation. So, how did they avoid freezing? The answer lies in layers, and lots of them. The first and most crucial layer was getting off the floor. Stone floors could literally suck the heat right out of your body. The simplest solution was a mattress, but not the kind you're used to. For the common folk, this meant a palliasa, tough fabric sack stuffed with whatever was available. Straw was the most common filling, hence the term straw mattress. It was cheap, easy to find, and provided a surprisingly effective barrier against the cold stone. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Straw was also a cozy home for fleas, lice, and other critters, which is probably where the saying, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite," comes from. If you were a bit wealthier, your mattress might be stuffed with something softer, like wool, feathers, or even horsehair. These materials were more comfortable and offered better insulation, but they were also much more expensive. Regardless of the filling, these mattresses were placed on simple wooden bed frames, further lifting the sleeper away from the frigid floor. Now, let's talk about the bed itself. The iconic four-poster bed wasn't just a status symbol. It was a clever piece of climate control technology. Heavy curtains, often made of thick wool or velvet, would be drawn around the bed at night. This created a small, enclosed spacer room within a room. The sleeper's own body heat, combined with that of anyone they might be sharing the bed with, would be trapped inside this cozy tent, raising the temperature significantly. These curtains also offered a rare bit of privacy and helped keep out drafts that whistled through the poorly sealed windows and doors of the castle. This wasn't just about saving space, it was a vital survival strategy. More bodies meant more warmth. In a world without electric blankets, your bedfellow was your best source of heat. Animal pelts from bears, wolves, or sheep were particularly prized for their incredible warmth. Imagine burrowing under a mountain of heavy wool and soft fur while the wind howls outside your stone walls. It sounds pretty snug, doesn't it? And what about pajamas? Forget comfy cotton PJ. Most people in the Middle Ages slept either in their undergarments, the linen smock or shirt they wore during the day, or completely naked. This might seem counterintuitive in the cold, but remember, they were cocooned inside their curtained beds, under heaps of blankets, often with other people. Once you were tucked in, you were probably quite toasty. For the very wealthy, they might have a special nightshirt, but for the majority, their day shirt did double duty. To top it all off, they even had a medieval version of the hot water bottle. A bed warmer was a metal pan with a long handle. You'd fill it with hot coals from the fireplace, close the lid, and then run it between the sheets to warm up the bed before you got in. Even the location of bedrooms was strategic. The lord and lady's private chamber, known as the solar, was often situated on an upper floor directly above the Great Hall. The reality was often freezing cold, especially during the harsh winters. Imagine stone walls that are meters thick, but they don't just keep enemies out. They also trap the cold in. So, how did people survive the nights without modern heating? It was a constant battle against the bone-chilling dampness. Let's step back in time into a vast, drafty castle chamber. The only real source of heat is a massive fireplace, but its warmth barely reaches the corners of the room. The air is so cold you can see your breath. This is where the story of a good night's sleep begins, and it's a story of ingenuity and survival. Before anyone could even think about climbing into bed, they had to prepare it. An unprepared bed in a medieval castle wasn't a place of comfort. It was a block of ice waiting to steal all your body heat. The solution, a simple but brilliant invention, the bed warmer. Now, when I say bed warmer, you might picture a hot water bottle. But we're talking about something far more primitive and honestly, a bit more dangerous. The earliest and most basic method involved stones. Servants would heat smooth, flat stones or even bricks directly in the embers of the fireplace. They'd get them scorching hot, then carefully wrap them in thick layers of cloth. This was crucial because an unwrapped hot stone could easily set the entire bed on fire. Remember, mattresses were stuffed with straw, hay, or feathers, highly flammable materials. Once wrapped, these hot bundles were placed strategically inside the bed, tucked under the covers. The servants had to be quick, moving them around to distribute the warmth evenly, creating a cozy pocket of heat in an otherwise frigid environment. It was a race against time, warming the bed just enough before the stones cooled down. For the wealthy lords and ladies, this was a nightly ritual performed by their staff. But for everyone else, if they were lucky enough to have a proper bed, it was a task they had to manage themselves. As time went on, technology improved and a more sophisticated device appeared, the metal warming pan. This was a long-handled pan, usually made of brass or copper, with a hinged, perforated lid. It looked a bit like a modern frying pan with a cover. Instead of stones, servants would scoop hot embers and coals directly from the fireplace and place them inside the pan. The lid was then snapped shut, and the whole apparatus was slid between the sheets. The long handle was key. It allowed the servant to sweep the pan back and forth across the entire length and width of the bed without having to climb in. The perforations in the lid let the heat radiate out, gently warming the bedding. But this method had its own risks. If a spark or a hot coal escaped through the holes, it could instantly ignite the bed linens. It was a job that required care and attention. You can imagine the smell of hot metal and a faint smokiness filling the air as the bed was prepared. It was the scent of impending warmth and comfort. But let's not forget the bed itself. The grand four-poster beds we often see in movies weren't just for show. They were a vital piece of survival technology. The heavy, thick curtains that surrounded the bed weren't for privacy alone. They were for insulation. Once you were tucked into your pre-warmed bed, you'd draw the curtains shut. This created a small, contained microenvironment, a tent of warmth. The curtains trapped your body heat and the residual warmth from the warming pan, protecting you from the cold drafts that snaked through the stone chamber. It was like sleeping in a cozy fabric room within a room. The bedding itself was also crucial. Layers upon layers were a necessity. They would have linen sheets, followed by wool blankets, and topped with heavy fur throws if they could afford them. Think bearskins, wolf pelts, or fox furs. These layers trapped air, which is an excellent insulator. The more layers, the warmer you'd be. The mattress, stuffed with anything from straw and horsehair for the less fortunate to soft down feathers for the rich, also provided a thick barrier against the cold wooden bed frame. So, picture the full scene. A servant has just finished running the warming pan through the bed. The stones, now cooling, have been removed. The air is crisp and cold, but inside the curtained-off four-poster, a small sanctuary of warmth awaits. The lord or lady would quickly disrobe, often sleeping in their undergarments or a simple nightshirt, and jump into bed, pulling the heavy blankets and furs up to their chin. They would draw the curtains tight, sealing themselves in for the night. It's a fascinating glimpse into the daily struggles and clever solutions of medieval life. The simple act of going to bed, which we take for granted, was a carefully managed process. It shows us that comfort is relative. What we might consider a hardship was, for them, a welcome and necessary nightly routine. The warmth of a preheated bed wasn't just a luxury. It was essential for a restful and, more importantly, a healthy night's sleep. Without it, the relentless cold could lead to illness. Next time you find yourself complaining that your bedroom is a little chilly, spare a thought for the people of the Middle Ages. They weren't just sleeping. They were actively fighting the cold every single night with hot stones, pans of coals, and layers of curtains and fur. Let's be honest, those giant stone walls were amazing for defense, but terrible for insulation. So, how did they survive the night? The answer is simpler and a lot cozier than you might think. Forget those flimsy, silky nightgowns you see in historical dramas. That's pure Hollywood fantasy. The reality was much more practical. People slept fully dressed, and I mean fully dressed. It was all about layering. Think of it as their own personal, wearable heating system. The foundation of this system was wool. Wool was the super fabric of the Middle Ages. It's an incredible natural insulator. Even when it gets a little damp, it retains most of its heating properties, which was perfect for the often damp environment of a stone castle. So, a typical person, from a servant to a lord, would go to bed wearing their undergarments, which were usually made of linen. Linen isn't as warm as wool, but it was softer against the skin and easier to wash. Over that, they'd wear their daily clothes, their tunic or kirtle, often made of wool. And on top of that, they might add another layer, like a woolen cloak or a fur-lined robe, if they could afford it. They'd also wear thick woolen socks or hose, and often a cap or a bonnet on their head. A huge amount of body heat is lost through your head, so keeping it covered was just common sense. They basically bundled up like they were about to go for a walk in the snow, but instead they were just getting into bed. But clothing was only part of the equation. The bed itself was a fortress against the cold. The centerpiece was the four-poster bed, which wasn't just for decoration or privacy. It was a vital piece of survival equipment. These beds were surrounded by heavy, thick curtains, often made of wool or velvet. When these curtains were drawn, they created a small, enclosed space, almost like a room within a room. This bedchamber would trap the body heat of the sleepers, creating a much warmer microclimate than the rest of the freezing room. It was like sleeping in a cozy tent inside your bedroom. And they didn't sleep alone. It was very common for family members and even trusted servants to share a bed for warmth. The more bodies, the more body heat, the warmer the little tent of a bed would be. It sounds strange to our modern sensibilities about personal space, but it was a practical solution to a life-threatening problem. Privacy was a luxury they simply couldn't afford when survival was on the line. The mattress itself was also designed for warmth. It wouldn't have been a comfortable spring mattress like we have today. Instead, it was a thick sack, often made of tough canvas, stuffed with whatever insulating material was available. For the wealthy, this could be soft feathers or down, which are fantastic insulators. For common folk, it would be straw, dried leaves, horsehair, or even wool scraps. While not as luxurious, a thick straw mattress still provided a significant barrier against the cold seeping up from the stone floors below. On top of this, they would pile on layers of blankets, wool covers, and sometimes animal furs if they were wealthy. We're talking a serious mountain of bedding. Let's not forget other little tricks they used before bedtime. A servant might run a long-handled brass or copper warming pan filled with hot embers from the fireplace between the sheets. This would take the initial chill off the bed, making it much more inviting. It was the medieval equivalent of an electric blanket. They also used heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth, which would radiate warmth for hours. These simple, low-tech solutions were incredibly effective. So, when you picture life in a medieval castle, don't imagine people shivering miserably all night. They were resourceful. Through a clever combination of layered woolen clothing, curtained beds, shared body heat, and insulating bedding, they created surprisingly warm and snug sleeping environments. They turned their beds into cozy little havens, sealing themselves off from the harsh, cold reality of their stone surroundings. It was a nightly battle against the elements, and through these simple but ingenious methods, they won. It really makes you appreciate your thermostat and duvet, doesn't it? You see these huge, drafty stone fortresses in movies and think there's no way that was comfortable. And you'd be right. Without central heating, staying warm was a serious, life or death business, especially during the icy grip of winter. Forget about wandering around in your pajamas. The reality was a constant battle against the cold. So, what was their secret weapon against the nighttime chill? It wasn't some magical medieval invention. It was something surprisingly simple, something you might even associate with cartoons or old storybooks. The humble nightcap. That's right, that floppy, often tasseled hat wasn't just a fashion statement for Ebenezer Scrooge. It was a crucial piece of survival gear. Think about it. We lose a significant amount of body heat through our heads. In a room where you can see your breath, covering your head was a non-negotiable part of bundling up for the night. These weren't just any flimsy hats, either. They were typically made of thick wool or flannel, materials excellent at trapping heat and keeping your head and ears toasty warm. Putting on your nightcap was the final, essential step in a nightly ritual to conserve every last bit of precious body heat. But a nightcap alone wouldn't cut it. The medieval bedroom was a fortress within a fortress, designed with multiple layers of defense against the cold. The centerpiece of this strategy was the bed itself. We're talking about massive 4-poster beds, which were basically small rooms. They were enclosed with heavy, thick curtains, often made of velvet or wool, sometimes even lined with fur for the ultra-wealthy. When you drew those curtains shut, you created a small, insulated microenvironment. Your own body heat, combined with that of anyone else in the bed. And yes, families often shared beds for warmth, would be trapped inside this fabric tent, raising the temperature significantly compared to the rest of the freezing chamber. It was a cozy little cocoon, shielded from the relentless drafts that whistled through the stone walls. Then you have the bedding. This wasn't your modern, lightweight duvet. Mattresses were stuffed with whatever was available, straw for the less fortunate, but feathers, down, and wool for those who could afford it. On top of that, you'd pile on the layers. We're talking multiple heavy wool blankets, linen sheets, and perhaps a fur throw or a thick quilt on the very top. People would sleep buried under a mountain of textiles. It was less about comfort and more about pure insulation. You didn't just get asterisk into asterisk bed, you burrowed into a nest. Every layer was another barrier against the biting cold seeping through the stone walls and wooden shutters. And what were they wearing under all those blankets? Definitely not their birthday suits. People in the Middle Ages typically slept in their underclothes, which was a long linen shirt or smock called a chemise. Think of it as their base layer. It helped to keep the more expensive outer layers of bedding clean, and it provided another thin, but important, layer of insulation right against the skin. So, you have the chemise, the mountain of blankets, the enclosed four-poster bed, and the all-important nightcap. It was a multi-layered system, a complete strategy for survival. Let's not forget the heat sources they did have. While there was no central heating, many bedchambers, at least for the lord and lady, would have a large fireplace. This would be roaring all evening, warming the stone walls and the room itself. But fires are greedy things. They consume a lot of wood, and it was a servant's full-time job just to keep them fed. Plus, for safety, the fire would usually be banked or allowed to die down to embers overnight. So while it helped to take the edge off the initial chill when you went to bed, its warmth wouldn't last until morning. This is where another clever little device came in handy. The bed warmer. This was a metal pan with a long handle filled with hot coals or embers from the fireplace. A servant would run this pan between the sheets right before their master or mistress got into bed, warming the cold linen and creating an initial blast of glorious heat. It was like a primitive electric blanket, providing that crucial initial comfort to help you fall asleep before the deep cold of the night truly set in. So, when you picture someone in a medieval castle, don't just imagine a shivering noble in a vast, cold hall. Picture them tucked away in their curtained bed, buried under layers of wool and fur, with a warm cap on their head, in a space preheated by a roaring fire and a clever bed warmer. It might not have been the height of modern comfort, but through a combination of smart design, lots of layers, and a few clever tricks, they found ways to endure the night and wake up, maybe not perfectly toasty, but alive to see another day. It just goes to show that human ingenuity has always found a way to make even the harshest environments livable. You see them in movies, all grand and majestic, but trust me, living in one was anything but a cozy fairy tale, especially during winter. Forget central heating. We're talking about massive stone rooms that were basically giant refrigerators. The main source of heat was a gigantic fireplace, but its warmth barely reached a few feet away. The rest of the room, ice-cold stone walls, stone floors, and high ceilings, meant any heat just vanished. People would huddle around the fire, bundled in layers of wool and fur, but the moment they moved away, the biting cold would hit them again. It was a constant battle against the chill. So, how did they survive the nights? Sleeping was a particularly frigid affair. Bedrooms were often located far from the main hall's fireplace, and even with smaller fireplaces in the chambers of the wealthy, the cold was relentless. Heavy curtains were hung around beds to trap some warmth, creating a little micro-environment, but it was still freezing. They'd pile on thick blankets, fur throws, and anything they could find to insulate themselves. But even that often wasn't enough. Imagine trying to sleep when you can see your own breath and the sheets feel like they remade of ice. It was a miserable experience that we can hardly imagine today. This is where our furry friends come in. Long before electric blankets were even a dream, people had a much cuter, four-legged solution, their dogs. That's right, dogs were the original, all-natural, self-regulating bed warmers of the Middle Ages. It wasn't just about companionship. It was a practical matter of survival. Before climbing into bed, a lord or lady would have their dogs jump up onto the mattress. These loyal companions, with their warm bodies, would curl up on the cold sheets and start radiating heat like living, breathing hot water bottles. After a while, the bed would be pre-warmed and toasty, ready for its human occupant. And it wasn't just for a few minutes. Often, the dogs would stay in the bed all night long, snuggled up with their owners. This provided a continuous source of warmth that could make the difference between a night of shivering and a decent night's sleep. The practice was so common that it's even reflected in language. The term three-dog night is said to originate from this very practice, describing a night so cold that you need three dogs in bed with you to stay warm. It perfectly illustrates how integral these animals were to daily comfort and survival in a harsh medieval world. Different breeds were favored for this important job. While any dog could provide some warmth, larger breeds with thick coats, like Irish wolfhounds or mastiffs, were particularly effective. They were like big, furry furnaces. But smaller dogs weren't left out. Lapdogs, like the ancestors of modern toy breeds, were also popular, especially with noble women. They were easy to carry around and could be tucked right under the covers, providing a concentrated spot of heat exactly where it was needed. These weren't just pampered pets. They were performing a vital function, a cozy symbiosis between human and canine. This relationship highlights something beautiful about the medieval bond with animals. It wasn't just utilitarian, it was deeply personal. While a dog's ability to hunt or guard was valued, its role as a source of comfort and warmth forged a unique and intimate connection. Sharing a bed with a dog was an act of trust and affection. In a world that was often harsh and unforgiving, the simple, reliable warmth of a loyal dog provided not just physical comfort, but emotional solace as well. It was a partnership built on mutual benefit. The dog got a safe, comfortable place to sleep, and the human got to survive the night without freezing. If you look closely at medieval art, you'll often see dogs depicted at the feet of their owners on tomb effigies. While this can symbolize loyalty and fidelity, some historians believe it might also be a nod to this very practical aspect of their relationship. The loyal companion who kept them warm, even in the symbolic sleep of death. It shows just how deeply this role was ingrained in the culture. These weren't just animals, they were cherished members of the household, contributing in a very real and tangible way to the family's well-being. So, the next time you see a grand, imposing castle, don't just think of kings, queens, and knights in shining armor. Picture the cold, dark nights inside those stone walls. And remember the clever, cozy solution they found. Remember the packs of loyal dogs, big and small, curling up on beds, their warm bodies chasing away the chill, one happy sigh at a time. It's a testament to the incredible ingenuity of people and the enduring, heartwarming bond we share with our canine companions. Long before technology, there was a simpler, furrier solution to staying warm. Forget what you've seen in movies with roaring fires in every room. The reality was much, much colder. So, how did they not freeze in their sleep? Let's uncover the clever and sometimes desperate ways medieval folks battled the winter chill. First, let's talk about the heart of the castle, the Great Hall. This was the central hub of activity, and it usually had the largest fireplace. The entire household, from the lord and lady down to the servants, would gather here. It was a communal effort to stay warm. The fire wasn't just for heat, it was for cooking, light, and socializing. But once you left the immediate vicinity of that fire, the temperature dropped dramatically. The stone walls of the castle acted like a giant refrigerator, storing the cold and making the rest of the building incredibly chilly. So, what about the private chambers, the bedrooms? These were often smaller, which was a good thing. A smaller space is easier to heat, but they rarely had their own fireplaces, especially for anyone other than the highest nobility. This is where clever design and textiles came into play. The most important defense against the cold was the bed itself. Think of a medieval noble's bed. It wasn't just a mattress on a frame. It was a room within a room. We're talking about massive four-poster beds, but not just for decoration. These beds were enclosed with heavy, thick curtains, often made of wool or velvet and lined with fur. When you drew those curtains shut, you created a small, insulated tent. Your own body heat combined with that of anyone else in the bed, and yes, they often shared beds for warmth, would be trapped inside this fabric cocoon. It could raise the temperature inside the bed curtains by several degrees, making a huge difference. Underneath them, they didn't have modern mattresses. They slept on straw-filled pallets, which actually provided decent insulation from the cold floor. On top, they'd pile on layers and layers of blankets, furs, and heavy quilts. They knew the principle of layering, trapping air between each sheet to create an insulating barrier. They'd use anything they could get their hands on. Wolf pelts, bear skins, sheepskins, you name it. It was all about creating a warm, cozy nest to survive the night. But what about the drafts? Those huge, unglazed or poorly glazed windows were a major source of cold air. Glass was incredibly expensive in the Middle Ages. So many windows were just openings in the stone, maybe covered with oiled parchment or thin sheets of horn, which didn't do much to stop the wind. The primary solution was solid wooden shutters. At night, these shutters were barred tight, creating a solid barrier against the howling winter winds. They might even stuff cloth or straw into the cracks to seal them further. It made the room pitch black, but it was a small price to pay for blocking that icy draft. And they didn't sleep in flimsy pajamas. People in the medieval period often slept in their underclothes, the same linen smock or shirt they wore during the day. Or they'd have specific nightshirts and nightcaps, all designed to keep them warm. A nightcap was essential for preventing heat loss from your head. It might sound simple, but it was a surprisingly effective piece of thermal gear. Beyond the bedroom, they had other tricks. Tapestries weren't just for decoration. Hanging huge, heavy tapestries on the cold stone walls added a crucial layer of insulation. It prevented the cold from radiating directly into the room and helped to deaden drafts that snuck through the stonework. Think of it as medieval Lyra wall insulation. The floors, too, were covered, not with wall-to-wall carpeting, but with layers of rushes or straw, often mixed with fragrant herbs to combat the damp, musty smell. This floor covering provided another layer of insulation from the frigid stone below. Warming pans were another ingenious invention. This was a metal pan with a long handle filled with hot coals from the main fire. A servant would run this pan between the sheets of the bed right before the lord and lady got in, warming it up so they wouldn't have to get into an ice-cold bed. It was like a medieval electric blanket. Let's not forget personal heating. People carried around heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth to warm their hands. And of course, there was the simple strategy of wearing more clothes. Indoors, people wore multiple layers, often including fur-lined cloaks or gowns. They didn't just shed all their layers the moment they stepped inside like we do. Food and drink also played a role. Winter diets were rich in fats and calories to provide the body with the fuel it needed to generate heat. They drank warm beverages like mulled wine or ale, spiced concoctions that warmed you from the inside out. So, while we might imagine a romantic fairy tale existence, life in a medieval castle during winter was a constant battle for warmth. It was a combination of architectural features like shutters, brilliant use of textiles like bed curtains and tapestries, and simple, practical habits. They used communal living, layered clothing, and clever tools like warming pans to create small pockets of warmth in a vast, cold stone structure. It was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience in the face of a freezing world. Next time you see a castle, don't just think of kings and knights. Think of the incredible effort it took just to stay warm through a single winter night. The real secret to staying warm in a medieval castle wasn't just about fire. It was about fabric, specifically enormous, beautiful, and incredibly practical tapestries. Imagine this: you're in a great hall. The walls are thick stone, and you can practically feel the cold radiating off them. The wind is howling outside, finding every little crack to sneak through. It's not a cozy picture, is it? This is where tapestries came in. These weren't just decorations. They were a vital piece of medieval technology. Hung on the walls, they created a crucial layer of insulation. Think of it like putting on a thick woolen coat. The tapestry trapped a layer of air between the fabric and the cold stone, which dramatically reduced the amount of cold that seeped into the room. This simple principle made a huge difference in the ambient temperature, turning a frigid, unwelcoming space into something much more livable. But their job didn't stop at insulation. Stone walls also tend to be damp, especially in the notoriously wet climates of places like Britain and France. This dampness would make the cold feel even more bone-chilling. Tapestries helped combat this by acting as a moisture barrier, keeping the dampness of the walls from making the room feel clammy and miserable. So, they were fighting a two-front war against both cold and damp. Now, these weren't just plain old blankets hanging on the wall. Medieval tapestries were masterpieces of art and status. They were incredibly expensive, woven with intricate designs using wool and silk threads, sometimes even gold and silver. A large tapestry could take a team of skilled weavers years to complete, making them more valuable than the castle itself in some cases. The scenes depicted on them told stories, biblical tales, famous battles, mythological creatures, or scenes from courtly life. They were the medieval equivalent of fine art, cinema, and a history book, all rolled into one. For the lord and lady of the castle, these tapestries were a way to show off their immense wealth, sophistication, and power to any guest who walked through their doors. The more tapestries you had, and the more elaborate they were, the more important you were, and their versatility was amazing. They weren't permanently fixed to the walls. Noble families were often itinerant, moving between their various castles and manors throughout the year. And when they moved, their tapestries moved with them. They would be taken down, rolled up, and transported in carts to the next residence. This meant that no matter which cold stone castle they found themselves in, they could quickly make it feel like home, bringing their warmth, their color, and their stories with them. They were portable, luxury, and comfort. In a way, they were the original mobile home decor. The placement of tapestries was also strategic. They were hung not just in the Great Hall, but also in private chambers, like the Lord's solar or the lady's bedroom. Special attention was paid to covering the wall behind the head of the bed. This was crucial because drafts were a constant problem. A tapestry hung behind the bed, known as a dorsal, protected the sleepers from icy drafts that could lead to sickness. Sometimes they'd even create entire fabric rooms within a larger room, using tapestries as dividers to create smaller, more intimate, and easier to heat spaces. Imagine a cozy little tent made of beautiful story-filled fabric, set up right inside a vast, drafty chamber. So while the fireplace was the heart of the room, providing light and a focal point of heat, it was the tapestries that truly transformed the living experience in a medieval castle. They were the unsung heroes of comfort, battling the cold and damp with every thread. They insulated, decorated, told stories, and displayed wealth. Next time you see a picture of a medieval castle interior, don't just look at the suits of armor or the grand fireplace. Pay attention to the tapestries hanging on the walls. They're not just pretty pictures. They read a testament to medieval ingenuity and a key to how people survived and even thrived in a world without central heating. They are the woven warmth that made a cold stone house a home. Now, when you picture a medieval castle, what comes to mind? Towering stone walls, drafty corridors, maybe a grand roaring fireplace in the great hall. But what about the floors? For most of the castle, you'd be walking on cold, hard stone. In an age before central heating, that stone floor would feel like a giant slab of ice, especially during those long, brutal winters. So, how did the lords and ladies, and even their servants, keep their feet from freezing? The answer lies in something we still use today: rugs. But these weren't just any old throw rugs. We're talking thick, heavy textiles, luxurious furs, and woven tapestries laid across the freezing stone. It was a simple yet brilliant solution to a very real problem. You see, stone is a fantastic conductor of heat, which is a terrible quality when you're trying to stay warm. Your body heat would be sucked right out through the soles of your shoes and into the floor. This process, called conduction, is relentless. By laying down a thick rug, you create a layer of insulation. The air trapped within the fibers of the rug is a poor conductor of heat, which means it slows down that heat transfer, effectively creating a thermal barrier between your feet and the icy floor. It was a game changer for comfort. These floor coverings weren't just functional, they were also a major status symbol. The quality and origin of your rugs said a lot about your wealth and connections. Imagine a high-ranking lord's private chambers. The floors wouldn't be bare stone. They'd likely be covered with imported Persian carpets, known for their intricate designs and rich colors, or perhaps the thick, shaggy furs of bears and wolves. These weren't just for show. Walking on a plush wool carpet or a soft animal hide instead of frigid stone would have felt like pure luxury. It was the medieval equivalent of having heated floors. These items were incredibly expensive, often costing more than a servant would earn in a lifetime. They were precious heirlooms, passed down through generations, and listed in wills alongside jewelry and land. And it wasn't just about keeping your feet warm. Covering the floors had other benefits. It helped to dampen sound, reducing the echoes that would bounce off the stone walls and making the castle feel a little less like a cavern and more like a home. They also added a splash of color and artistry to what could be very drab and gray interiors. Many of the wall tapestries we see in museums today might have actually spent part of their lives on the floor, serving this dual purpose of insulation and decoration. Think of the Bayeux tapestry, for example. While it tells a grand story, its fundamental nature as a large piece of textile means it could have provided significant warmth. But what about the common areas or the servants' quarters? They might not have had lavish imported carpets, but they still needed to combat the cold. Cheaper, locally made textiles would have been used. Think simple, coarse wool rugs, or even layers of dried reeds and rushes, which were spread thickly on the floor. While not as glamorous, these rushes served the same insulating purpose. They'd trap air and provide a barrier against the cold stone. The downside, they were a nightmare to keep clean, often becoming smelly and attracting pests. They had to be regularly swept out and replaced with fresh ones, a constant chore for the castle staff. It's a detail that reminds us of the huge gulf between the lives of the nobility and the common folk. So, the next time you see a movie set in a medieval castle and notice the floors, pay attention. Are they covered in rich tapestries and furs, or are they bare and foreboding? This small detail tells you a huge amount about the wealth, status, and day-to-day comfort of the people who lived there. It shows how medieval people used clever, practical solutions to make their imposing stone fortresses into livable homes. The simple act of laying a rug on the floor was a crucial defense in the constant battle against the cold. It was a small touch of warmth and humanity in a harsh and unforgiving world. The humble rug wasn't just decoration. It was a vital piece of medieval technology. It really puts our modern comforts into perspective, doesn't it? We can just flip a switch for our thermostat, but they had to rely on fireplaces, heavy clothing, and these all-important floor coverings. It's these everyday details that truly bring history to life. What other medieval survival hacks are you curious about? Let me know down in the comments. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, totally wide awake, and thought, oh no, my sleep schedule is ruined? Well, what if I told you that for centuries, waking up in the middle of the night was completely normal? In fact, it was the standard way to sleep. Picture this. You're tucked into bed inside a massive stone castle. It sounds grand, but in reality, it's freezing. Castles were notoriously drafty and difficult to heat. There's no central heating, no electric blankets, just a single fireplace crackling in the corner of a vast, cold room. The stone walls seemed to leach warmth from the very air. So, how did people survive the frigid nights without freezing in their sleep? They adapted not just their homes, but their own sleep patterns. This is where the fascinating concept of first sleep and second sleep comes in. Instead of one long, uninterrupted block of sleep, like we aim for today, people in the medieval period and even later had a segmented sleep schedule. you'd sleep for about 4 hours, and this was known as the first sleep. This waking period, lasting for an hour or two, was a quiet, contemplative, and surprisingly productive time. For many, especially in a cold castle, the first priority was practical survival. The fire in the hearth would be dying down, its comforting glow reduced to embers. The 2 blocks of sleep combined provided a full night's rest. This pattern wasn't just for people in castles. It was common across all social classes throughout Europe for hundreds of years. The first historical mentions of it date back to ancient times. It wasn't until the advent of industrialization and, crucially, artificial street lighting in the late 17th and 18th centuries that our sleep patterns began to change. With streets and homes lit up later into the evening, people's social lives extended. The night was no longer just for sleeping. People stayed up later, socializing, working, or enjoying entertainment. This pushed bedtimes later and began to consolidate sleep into one single block. The quiet, dark interval between 2 sleeps gradually disappeared from our collective experience. By the 20th century, the idea of a segmented sleep pattern was almost completely forgotten. Waking up in the middle of the night became a problem to be solved, a form of insomnia rather than a natural rhythm. Medical literature began to prescribe a single 8-hour block as the ideal, and anything else was seen as a disorder. But here's the interesting part. Modern sleep science is starting to suggest that our ancestors might have been onto something. Some sleep researchers believe that this biphasic, or segmented, sleep pattern might actually be more natural for humans. When people are placed in environments without artificial light, they often naturally revert to this first sleep, second sleep pattern. This also helps explain why so many people today experience what's called maintenance insomnia, where you fall asleep easily but wake up in the middle of the night and get back to sleep for an hour or two. Perhaps it's not a disorder at all, but an echo of an ancient, ingrained sleep cycle trying to reassert itself in a modern world that doesn't accommodate it. So, The next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., instead of stressing about it, maybe you can try to reframe it. Don't reach for your phone, which can make it harder to get back to sleep. Instead, think of it as your own personal watching hour, just like your medieval ancestors. Maybe get up, check that everything is secure, have a glass of water, or just sit quietly in the dark and let your mind wander. You might find that after a little while, the call of the second sleep comes naturally. It's a fascinating look at how our bodies and behaviors are shaped by our environment. The simple act of keeping a fire alive through a cold night shaped the very rhythm of sleep for generations. It shows us that many things we consider normal today are actually quite recent inventions, and that looking to the past can give us a whole new perspective on our own lives. So, while we may be grateful for our central heating and cozy beds, there's a certain romance to the idea of that quiet, fire-lit hour in the middle of a medieval night. It's a reminder that there's more than one way to live, and more than one way to sleep. The reality, especially during winter, was brutal, cold, and downright uncomfortable. Castles were basically giant, beautiful refrigerators. So, how did the lords, ladies, and everyone else even survive a single freezing night? Well, the answer wasn't magic. It was hard, relentless work, mostly done by servants. The heart of any room, the only source of warmth, was the fireplace. But a fire doesn't just burn all night on its own. It needs constant attention. And that's where the unsung heroes of the castle come in. The servants tasked with keeping the fires alive. Picture this. It's the middle of the night. The wind is howling outside, rattling the shutters. Inside a vast stone chamber, a lord and lady are bundled under layers of heavy furs and wool blankets in their grand four-poster bed. The air is so cold you can see your breath. In the corner, a massive fireplace crackles, casting long, dancing shadows. But the flames are dying down. Just as the chill starts to creep back into the room, a sleepy servant shuffles in. They've likely been dozing on a simple pallet just outside the door, or in a cold hallway, waiting for this moment. Their job, all night long, every night, is to tiptoe into the room, carefully add more logs to the fire, and coax it back to life without waking the sleeping nobles. It was a freezing, thankless task. These servants had to stay awake, or wake up every hour or two, enduring the cold themselves, just so the masters could sleep in relative warmth. And this wasn't just for the Lord's chamber. Every important room, the great hall, the solar, private chambers for important guests each had a fireplace that needed feeding. This meant a small army of servants was dedicated to the fire watch throughout the castle. They would haul heavy logs up winding staircases and stay alert through the coldest, darkest hours. Let's talk about those fireplaces. Early medieval castles had very basic ones. Often it was just a central hearth in the middle of the great hall, with a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. Yes, a hole in the roof. Can you imagine? Rain, snow, and freezing drafts would just come right in. It was smoky, inefficient, and probably didn't provide much heat unless you were sitting right next to it. Everyone else in the hall would still be shivering. Later on, wall fireplaces with chimneys became more common, which was a huge improvement. This design pulled the smoke up and out of the room, making the air much more breathable. But even with a chimney, these fireplaces were incredibly inefficient by modern standards. Most of the heat went straight up the flue. To feel any real warmth, you had to be practically sitting inside the hearth. So, beyond the fire, what other tricks did they use to stay warm? Layers, layers, and more layers. Clothing was made of wool and linen, and people wore multiple layers, day and night. At bedtime, they wouldn't just slip into silk pajamas. They'd often sleep in their day clothes, or at least some version of them, and pile on nightcaps and woolen socks. Beds themselves were a key part of the survival strategy. The classic four-poster bed wasn't just for show. It was a room within a room. Heavy curtains, often made of thick wool or velvet, would be drawn all around the bed. This trapped the sleeper's body heat and created a small, cozy micro-environment, shielded from the drafts that swirled through the rest of the chamber. People would also share beds for warmth. It wasn't uncommon for family members or even servants of the same gender to sleep together. And what about those less fortunate? The servants, soldiers, and other staff didn't have private chambers with roaring fires. Many would sleep in the great hall, on straw pallets on the floor, huddled together as close to the dying embers of the central hearth as they could get. For them, the cold was a constant companion. The straw they slept on might be damp, the blankets thin, and the stone floor beneath them would suck the warmth right out of their bodies. They also used portable sources of heat. A bed warmer, which was a metal pan with a long handle, would be filled with hot coals from the fire. A servant would then run this pan between the sheets to warm up the bed before the lord or lady got in. It was a moment of luxury, but you had to be careful not to set the bed on fire. Another interesting tool was the hand warmer. These were small, often ornate metal balls or boxes that could be filled with a piece of glowing charcoal. A lady might carry one of these inside a muff to keep her hands from freezing. But despite all these efforts, the cold was a serious threat. Sickness was rampant in winter. A simple cold could easily turn into pneumonia, which was often a death sentence. The damp, chilly conditions were terrible for respiratory health, and the lack of sanitation didn't help. Living in a castle during winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The very stone the castle was built from worked against them. Stone is a fantastic conductor of cold. Throughout the winter, the walls would absorb the freezing temperatures from outside and radiate that chill into every room, day and night. It was a cold that seeped into your bones. Tapestries were hung on the walls, not just for decoration, but to provide a layer of insulation, trying to block some of that penetrating cold. Thick rush mats, or, for the wealthy, woolen carpets, were laid on the floors for the same reason. So, the next time you see a movie set in a majestic medieval castle, look past the grandeur. Remember the drafty halls, the smoky rooms, and the shivering servants working through the night. Life in a castle was a constant battle against the elements, and staying warm was a full-time job. The simple comfort of a warm bed was a luxury won through the tireless efforts of others, a testament to the harsh realities of medieval life. Castles were huge, drafty stone fortresses, basically giant refrigerators in winter. Yet, for centuries, people not only survived, but slept soundly. It's a story of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a whole lot of layers. First, let's bust a myth. People didn't just shiver under a thin blanket and hope for the best. The heart of any medieval room, especially the bedroom, was the fireplace. These weren't just for decoration, they were vital survival tools. A large, roaring fire was kept burning all night long. Servants would be tasked with stoking the embers periodically to ensure the blaze never died out. The radiant heat would warm the stone walls around it, creating a pocket of relative comfort. The flickering light also provided a sense of security in the dark, cavernous rooms. Chimneys were a great invention, but early versions weren't always efficient, so rooms could get pretty smoky. Now, let's talk about the bed itself. The bed was more than just a place to sleep. It was a fortress against the cold. If you were wealthy, you had a magnificent four-poster bed. But this wasn't just a status symbol. The heavy, often ornate curtains surrounding the bed were crucial. They were made of thick materials, like wool or velvet, sometimes lined with fur. When drawn, these curtains trapped the sleeper's body heat, creating a warm, insulated microenvironment. Think of it as a tent within a room. This small, enclosed space would become significantly warmer than the rest of the chamber, shielding you from icy drafts that whistled through the castle. And what were they sleeping on? Mattresses were stuffed with whatever was available. For the rich, this meant soft feathers, down, or wool, which provided excellent insulation from the cold bed frame below. For the less fortunate, it might be straw, horsehair, or even pea shucks. While not as luxurious, a thick layer of straw still created a barrier against the cold. Then came the layers, and I mean lots of layers. They didn't just have one blanket. They would pile on multiple layers of woolen blankets, linen sheets, and luxurious, heavy furs. Bear, wolf, and fox pelts were not just for show. Their dense fur was incredibly effective at trapping heat. It was like being cocooned in a warm, heavy nest. But what about the majority of people in a castle who couldn't afford a private, curtained bed? This is where a simple, powerful concept came into play: shared body heat. For servants, soldiers, and families, sleeping was often a communal activity. Sharing a bed or a sleeping space with several others meant their combined body heat would keep everyone much warmer than they would be alone. And they didn't just rely on external heat sources. People wore clothes to bed. Think warm, woolen nightshirts, nightcaps, and even socks. The idea of sleeping nude in a freezing castle was completely unthinkable. A nightcap was especially important. You lose a significant amount of body heat through your head, so keeping it covered was a simple but very effective way to stay warm throughout the night. It's the same reason we wear hats in the winter today. Insulation wasn't just for the bed. The rooms themselves were designed to fight the cold. Forget bare stone walls. These weren't just decorative art pieces. They were a crucial layer of insulation. Hung on the cold stone walls, they trapped a layer of air, preventing the chill from seeping into the room. Instead, they were covered with layers of rushes, straw, or herbs, which provided insulation from the ground up. In wealthier homes, thick woolen or animal hide rugs would be placed on top of the rushes for extra warmth and comfort. They would then slide the pan between the sheets, moving it around to warm the entire bed. Imagine slipping into a pre-warmed bed on a frigid night. It was a simple but luxurious comfort that made a huge difference. Another trick was to heat up bricks or stones by the fire, wrap them in cloth, and place them at the foot of the bed. These primitive hot water bottles would radiate gentle heat for hours. So, how did people sleep in freezing medieval castles? They did it with a combination of clever engineering and common sense. It was a multi-layered defense system. The roaring fireplace was the first line of defense. The insulated room with its tapestries and floor coverings was the second. The curtained, fortress-like bed was the third. And the final, most intimate layer was the combination of thick bedding, warm sleepwear, and sometimes the shared heat of another person. It was a constant battle against the cold, but through these ingenious methods, the inhabitants of those magnificent stone castles managed to stay warm, sleep soundly, and survive the harshest of winters. It really makes you appreciate your modern thermostat, doesn't it? Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more historical deep dives. See you next time.